Good evening, everybody, and this is the monthly meeting of the Westchester Coalition for Police Reform. We have a very interesting agenda this evening, and we're starting off our meeting with an important conversation with the Commissioner for Public Safety for the City of Mount Vernon, Commissioner Glenn Scott. Thank you so much, Commissioner Scott, for being willing to speak with us this evening. And I'll just give people a sense of the evening. We will talk together. We'll have a conversation till a little bit after 7. Lucia Hermo was supposed to give a brief presentation on artificial intelligence, but she's not feeling well, which means we can take some questions from all of you in the chat. And then at 7:15, we'll hear a presentation about ending qualified immunity. And at 7:30, we'll segue to an evaluation of the Kenneth Chamberlain Vigil and next steps for Kenneth Chamberlain and his family. So without further ado, thank you again, Commissioner Scott. I wanted to start by asking you first, how did you get into the world of policing?
Well, my father had always wanted me to be have a civil service job. He says, you go civil service, you'll always be employed. And I always had a desire to be in law enforcement. You know, you were told that you could help people, that your life would have significant meaning. And it's been very rewarding for me. And I'm glad that I chose this profession.
It's wonderful. When I think about law enforcement, I think that if I look at the totality, and we've been reading so much about this, the totality of the Black experience in America with police and policing has been traumatic and rooted in a very traumatic history. And so I'm always curious, if you're comfortable answering, like, how do you reconcile for a lot of the Black community? There's a lot of fear when they encounter law enforcement. There's a lot of feeling of unease and tension that they're not being policed the way the white communities are being policed. Did you think about that before entering into law enforcement, or was it more a feeling that you could be part of transforming the institution so it's more equitable for your community?
Well, I really was introduced to law enforcement in Mount Vernon. I was managing a drugstore chain, and there were only a handful of Black police officers in Mount Vernon. And the discrepancy of the population being mainly Black and the amount of Blacks that there were in law enforcement actually encouraged me to join. I mean, from the community I grew up in, law enforcement was always important, but there was that stigma of being abused by law enforcement. And during the civil rights era, you saw that on a daily basis, and it was like you have to be in it to change it.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time I came into law enforcement, I believe the highest Black rank in Mount Vernon PD was a sergeant. And there were only 2 Blacks that had attained being a sergeant in that handful of police. So that encouraged me to do better and try harder. And I knew that I had to probably try harder than anybody that didn't have any melatonin in their skin.
Mm-hmm. Did you face any racial discrimination in the department?
Let's just say it was a struggle. I felt that you had to know and be able to accomplish 150% more than, people of non-color. I felt it was also very hard to get promoted, but these things I overcame, and I was granted with a blessed career.
Wonderful. Well, I'm happy to hear that, Commissioner Scott. I wanted to talk about the city of Mount Vernon, and just briefly, I'm going to share the latest census. Oh, I have to share my screen. Hold on one second. The latest census has come out, and by the way, it's available to the public. Are you all seeing this graph? Yeah. So you just see what the trajectory is. This is for the city of Mount Vernon. Total population, according to the latest census, is 73,893. It's gone up by 6,600 people, by 9.8%. So the white alone population has shrunk slightly. The black population has increased by 8%. There's a very tiny population of people who identify as indigenous or indigenous from Alaska. The Asian population has gone up 15%. Hawaiian Pacific Islander has gone down. The Latinx population has gone up by 46%. And then I was very curious about the housing units. There are 30,000 housing units in Mount Vernon. That's gone up by 4.7% since 2010. 93% occupancy rate, and vacant is 6.8%. Anyway, so, and then group quarters, which includes correctional facilities, juvenile institutions, nursing homes, etc. So that's the size of the city of Mount Vernon. What's the size of the police department, Commissioner Scott?
We're down to 182 officers.
I was reading that you have 20 to 30 vacancies.
That is correct.
Is that because of budgetary issues, or that you're unable to hire?
No, it's through people resigning, retiring, and leaving the department for more attractive departments out there. You know, if you can be an officer at Mount Vernon, you're topping out at $92,000 a year. Other departments top out at 130, 120 in our surrounding area. With the police reform coming out, other departments decided that instead of, or along with trying to do the reforms allocated by then Governor Cuomo, they decided that they would poach Mount Vernon Police because we were the most diversified department. So the quote, blacks and Hispanics that normally couldn't get into their departments, they poached from the Mount Vernon department.
Oh, the other municipalities in Westchester County.
That's correct.
I understand. And
So
do you have
those,
a budget? Do you have a budget to hire those 20 to 30 people, or is the budget tight that you're not really able to hire additional law enforcement for your department?
we have a budget, or I should say we'll have as of next year a budget to hire these people. Okay, you might be aware of the issues that we had with the comptroller's office and our bills not getting paid and unable to buy vehicles and things like that. And I don't know if you are aware, but the budget for 2022 allows us to hire.
Okay. Is the budget, so the budget for your department, is it overwhelmingly funded by Mount Vernon residents' taxes? Or do you also get funding from New York State, and do you get also funding from the federal government? How does it work?
Well, what they have is as far as the federal government, some of our manpower is funded from our interactions with the government. Some of it comes from, our budget comes from asset forfeiture, but the main budget comes from the taxpayers of Mount Vernon.
So in a sense, you know, if that's the main source, and I think that is the main source for most of the departments in the United States, That means Mount Vernon is at a disadvantage because the tax base is lower than other municipalities in Westchester County. So there's, a
That
smaller.
is absolutely true. That's right. And considering also that the police department hasn't had a contract in like 5 years, that's another reason that people are leaving Mount Vernon.
So you have a very densely populated, by the way, the city of Mount Vernon, for those who don't know, and many of you probably know, it's 4 square miles and it's densely populated. It's 73,000 people. But again, the census may not capture all the people in the city. So the actual number of people in Mount Vernon is probably higher. I don't know how much higher. But at any rate, it's a densely
I would say
populated. Go ahead.
I would say at least 20,000 more.
Wow.
Okay, the reason the census numbers even went up is because this administration had a very big census campaign with a lot of literature, a lot of press, and a lot of knocking on doors. So more people complied with the census. I don't think that more people moved in 1 year. It's just that more people actually filled out the census.
And,
Because
and for those
from
20,000 who did not fill out, in your estimation, do you think that's primarily undocumented people who want to protect themselves from federal scrutiny, or?
I think people have a fear of the census. They have a fear of being scrutinized by the federal government and others.
Okay, right. If you could tell us, Commissioner Scott, a little bit about how did your police reform process go? I know you said that other municipalities have taken your black and brown officers, leaving you understaffed. But beyond that, how do you feel about the process that you went through in response to the former Governor Cuomo's executive order on reimagining police?
Before we jump to that, would you like to know the demographics of the Mount Vernon Police Department?
Please.
Okay. We have 144 male. We have 38 female. That adds up to the 182 that I talked about. Out of that group, we have 64 that are black, 76 that are white, 38 that are Hispanic, and 6 people that I would classify of a mixed of more than one race. So basically, we are very diverse demographically. Touching on 21st century policing, our response for police reform started in January of 2020, before the George Floyd incident. When I started, I was starting off of based on the 21st century policing model that Obama had presented. And one of the things that was recommended under these stages and guidelines was police reform, was updating policies, was looking into use of force issues. So we started long before that. So I had policies in place where I was updating use of force in February of 2020, before May's incident of May 25th, George Floyd incident where he passed away. By the time the George Floyd incident came upon, I had already probably changed about 10 or 15 policies according to the guidelines of reform under Obama. So a lot of the recommendations that were done were already instituted. Now, because we had done everything from trying to increase the capabilities of our evidence collection and our record management systems, to, as I stated, putting use of force. I think the first part I wrote up, the policy I wrote was use of force, and it was about, I believe, de-escalation. Then by July, I had updated that policy to include positional asphyxiation, which is really what George Floyd was analyzed with dying from, and duty to intervene and de-escalation were all of those things that were in our use of force policy long before the governor put out the executive order. So I believe a lot of the findings that we had were a lot milder, such as better utilizing a POI, a police officer that was for public information, a public information officer. These things we still don't have. Okay, that was one of their recommendations, but we do have a city website. Mm-hmm. So we have a police web page on the city website that now gets out weekly information and updates to the public. So that was a thing that we just established with the city, is a new website. So that website, you can actually get police demographic, you can get demographics, police demographics, crime stats, all of that. And that website is PD, as in police department, .cmvny, City of Mount Vernon, New York, .com. Mm-hmm. And you'll find that that website has pictures of events that we're having in Mount Vernon, PD-sponsored wellness events that we have, because we put a wellness factor into the police department for both city residents. The quote, people who are arrested, but it's a mental health issue, and we're doing more and more mental health referrals than arresting. Mm-hmm. Okay.
One issue we discussed in the City of White Plains process was making it more accessible for people to file complaints if they've had an interaction with an officer that is less than acceptable, and making sure that these complaint forms are available not just online, but also at different places and community institutions around the City of White Plains. Did you talk about your complaint process?
I revamped that in November of 2020, the ease to file complaints. And now it's also on the city's website, the police department's website, where you do not have to come into this building to file a complaint.
Mm-hmm. And can you file a complaint anonymously? Or do you have to put your name?
You can file a complaint anonymously, but the process of the complaints is usually you need somebody to follow up with.
Right.
Okay. Or it'll be automatically unsubstantiated if you don't have a complainant to follow up with.
Yeah, Phyllis, we're going to get to that. That's our last point that I'll talk. Someone's asking about the Department of Justice investigation, and we'll definitely get to that. I do want to talk about Civilian Review Board, because I know that the previous council member of Mount Vernon, Johanna Edwards, worked hard on with community members on authorizing legislation for a community civilian oversight of the local department. And I think it passed city council, but there was no funding mandate, so it's not operational. Is that correct?
That is about the gist of it. There were several errors that were made. It went through the city council, but then it didn't go to the Board of Estimate, I believe, at that time. So there was actually no funding for it. So
what is your feeling about, Commissioner Scott, what do you feel about civilian oversight of law enforcement?
Depends on what type of oversight we're talking about. There's everything from there's certain things that
to having investigative authority and subpoena power.
Well, I agree with that, but I'm just wondering how they're actually going to get subpoena power. I mean, there were a lot of questions I had, but unfortunately, what I found out is that some of the reform commissions don't ask the police what they need. So if you don't know what difficulties we have in doing things, but yet we have to take all of the recommendations that you do or recommend, but nobody's ever talked to the police about what they need. Maybe we have more to add to it.
Mm-hmm.
That's the only thing I see that happens. So we had done a lot of training, a lot of revisions of policies back in 2020. So
And what do you feel are the biggest challenges right now for your local police department? What are some areas where you feel like if you had the resources, you would put in a lot more support?
first of all, we have to be brought up to full complement. Okay, we right now do not have even basic equipment in our vehicles. Right now, we don't even have a fleet of vehicles to even patrol the city.
Mm.
We have basically had no bills paid for the police department and no funding for any type of electronic improvements or anything. In fact, we don't even have basic equipment. We are currently operating without any tasers. We are currently operating without proper police vehicles. I mean, sometimes the guys go out on patrol using a community passenger van. That's not legal to respond to emergency calls.
Mm.
Okay, so they have to respond in kind, and that's slowing down services. What I'd like to say is that the police reform did an excellent job because they actually had recommendations that I wish that we could do. They had some very good recommendations is that if we had the funding, we could do. They wanted us to have body cameras for every member.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to have that. But due to the bills not being paid, we're down to about 10 body cameras. So I said we have no body cameras. We have basically no tasers for less lethal. Our pepper spray has all expired and we're not able to buy new ones. We actually, our less than lethal capabilities have been driven down to zero.
So are you saying that that sort of forces an officer to jump to more lethal force because they don't have less than lethal force?
What happens is that the officers are almost forced to engage in a physical action, then have something, a barrier to that. They are dealing more with de-escalation techniques and verbal techniques than ever, which is actually very good training for them, but they should have other options.
Right, absolutely. And one other question before we start talking about the Department of Justice's investigation into the City of Mount Vernon's police department. Anne is asking about what kind of data are you able to capture right now? Are you able to capture how many stops the police make, and is it disaggregated by race? Are you just collecting crime data? What kind of data are you able to collect regarding policing in Mount Vernon?
Almost nothing. Our record management system is broken. It often goes down and we're down to paper and pens. Our 911 system has gone down three and a half times since I've been appointed in 2020. So we lose 911 capability because none of the maintenance contracts have been paid for.
Oh my goodness, this sounds really very, very serious, and it's very distressing to hear this, Commissioner Scott. It actually is pointing to major structural problems with the whole institution of policing. I just want to tell people on this Zoom, in the United States, there are 18,000 police departments. In other countries, let's take Sweden, there's one single police department that's centrally managed for the entire country. Canada has 200 police departments. we have 18,000 and each department is supposed to be funded locally. And what does that mean? It means under-resourced communities don't have the same equipment, training, etc. as other departments where they have a much better tax base. So it's extremely unfair, I think, personally. And the financial scenario you're describing could actually be costing people's lives if you're telling us that your 911 system has gone down 3 times since you've been in office. I mean, this is really, I don't know if any of us knew how bad it was. But anyway, let's talk about the Department of Justice's investigation into your department. They made it clear in their press announcement that they're not looking at individual misconduct within your department. They're not looking at criminal behavior in your department, because that's currently being handled by the Westchester County District Attorney's Office, if I understand correctly. They're really looking at patterns and practice, and particularly the use of force by the Mount Vernon Police. They're looking at a pattern of racialized policing, discriminatory policing, where Black folk have been stripped and body cavity searched. They want to take a look at all your policies, your training, accountability measures. They want to look at your internal affairs department. They will be asking you for lots of documents, and they'll be meeting with community groups in Mount Vernon to ask people about what their experience has been with the local police. They also, after 1 year or however long it takes, will most likely enter into a binding agreement with the city of Mount Vernon, where your department will have to adopt probably most, if not all, of what they're recommending. So just tell us what your thoughts are about this investigation.
First of all, I would like to thank you for that excellent explanation on what they're actually going to do here, because, we've had everything from, the FBI stormed the police department, and, and they're looking into criminal activity and all of this. And you eloquently explained exactly what they're doing and made it very clear. And that is probably the first time that I've heard it explained properly. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
I would like to say that since I was appointed here in 2020, I have found discrepancies in reports and things like that. And these are the things that I turned over to Mimi Rocha's office, the district attorney's office. So I want to say that most of this DOJ investigation is probably based on things I was seeking out of the district attorney's office. Okay, because we were very transparent, because what happened in 2020 was the discovery process came out. That's a process where we have 15 days to turn over our case and all our information to whoever the suspect's attorney is. In doing that, we uncovered things from previous years, because the DA's office actually wanted us to go at least a year behind what was required. And then I came in office, and there was, let's call it just a bounty of paperwork of complaints, police disciplinary matters that hadn't been addressed since probably the year 2019, and I came in 2020. So that gave me the ability to say, well, if this incident happened 1, 2, 3 times, where's our policy on it? And that's how I started doing the policy reforms. And then there was a point where they had a very big splash in the local newspapers about whistleblowers and recording of whistleblowers and the suspects in the police department. Now, that caused me to get a transcript of the tape and go through line by line at least 1,000 pages. All of this stuff I prepped, turned over an investigation to the DA's office on. So the DA decided that they needed to do a DOJ, call for a DOJ investigation, which is actually what I needed. Because, and I need the guidelines, and I need the management. All of this is going to make us as more transparent.
Great.
We went and we tried to modernize the police department, and we were handicapped with not having access to equipment. We tried to transform the police department by putting policies and procedures in place long before the unfortunate George Floyd incident. We are not saying that we are perfect. We are admitting there are things wrong in this department. And we have invested our time to retraining, reviewing, revising policies and procedures, improving our disciplinary procedures, and building local, state, and federal partnerships to improve the public safety here. The DOJ, I believe, is going to bring an extra level of oversight and resources that we don't have and improve our capabilities. So I'm basically all for it. I welcome them in here. I wish I had enough manpower to assign them, but we'll
human power.
Right. Right. So I'm happy that the public should feel better after this investigation, and that's all that counts.
Yeah, and it's also pointing to a huge weakness where it doesn't seem rational for a big country to have 18,000 police departments make their own policies and procedures, as opposed to having the very best practices in modern day policing be standardized and have a national standard that every single police department must follow. We hear about a national accreditation process that some departments, if they're, that they can become part of or affiliated with. Well, what people want is the very best practices and policies to be implemented in every single department. And for you to be looking here and there at what should our policy be on use of force, it just seems so irrational that we don't have national standards for policing. I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
Well, I believe easier for police departments having standard guidelines in all aspects of policing.
So at least New York State has basic guidelines for each police department, for the 500 police departments?
Well, what I would say is that we have a accreditation process that is where they call for certain guidelines and certain policies and procedures, and you have to have a current policy and procedure manual with every police organization.
That's issued by New York. This is New York State mandates.
Well, that's the accreditation, yes, the accreditation. I don't know how much they standardize it, because I know they individually give accreditation to each department. I don't know if that requires the same standards for all or not. But right now, that's a very good idea that your organization has.
All right, Commissioner Scott. Well, it's 7:10, and we actually need to wind down. We have other agenda items, but I really very much appreciate you taking the time with us. Is there anything else that you'd like to say before we log off?
I just want to thank the hardworking men and women of the Mount Vernon Police Department for doing more with less.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for being with us.
Okay.
Good evening, everybody. You are attending the Westchester Coalition for Police Reform's monthly meeting, December 2021. We will be hearing a really interesting presentation about ending qualified immunity. We have a special guest from New York City, Katerina, who's working on a statewide campaign to end qualified immunity. But before we introduce Katerina, I'd like to welcome Sandy Burnaby and Lane Cobb, who are both local Westchester County residents who have been working on ending qualified immunity. Go ahead, Sandy and Lane.
Wonderful. I want to thank Commissioner Glenn Scott for his presentation earlier about what's going on in the Mount Vernon Police Department. And to me, it was very sad to hear what you had to say about how structural racism not only hurts the residents of Mount Vernon, but is also hurting the people who are there to protect the residents of Mount Vernon. And it was just so clear how the whole arrangement is structured to create an impoverished abuse system. And I know that we're not talking about, when we're talking about qualified immunity, we're not talking about any one police department, right? We're talking about racialized policing, culture of abuse within policing, and that it's a national problem. It clearly happened way before George Floyd, but we're hearing so much of it after George Floyd. In fact, it was Ari Melber who did a presentation that said that each year 1,000 people are killed by police officers, and yet another 500,000 unreported, but that the autopsies and the emergency rooms should be reporting these gun shots so that we would have a more accurate. A year after George Floyd was killed, that statistic is exactly the same. Nothing had changed. All these years of seeing this, all of the George Floyd trial, a year later, nothing had changed. Yet another 1,500 people were killed by police. Anyway, it was Kenneth Chamberlain. We were speaking to him and said, you know, what can we do to help? What is something that the Anti-Racist Alliance can do to help? And he said, stay focused on qualified immunity, because that's why, you know, Anthony Corelli is free today. Officer Corelli got away from killing my father because of qualified immunity. And so Lane and I started a journey of doing the research to really find out that, you know, within the legal system, just like the policing that we're hearing, that there are structured in the legal system mechanisms that shield police and other state employees from personal liability when wrongdoing has been done. And it also explains why year after year after year, another 1,000 will be killed and the police officers walk away, another 1,000. And we cannot believe that this is happening in front of our eyes. And yet this particular murder was found not to be illegal. And so in our search for qualified immunity, to understand that I'll just say right here, qualified immunity is a judicial doctrine developed by the Supreme Court, which shields state actors from liability for their misconduct when they break the law. And qualified immunity holds the defendants that they can't be sued unless they have violated a clearly established law, and that they knew that exactly what they were doing had been proven to be illegal, and they knew it ahead of time. And so it's amazing that this cannot be established. And so we watch over and over and over these murders. So we decided that we would, do you want to say something, Lane? That we decided that we would do a series to support
Sure.
Chamberlain. And Lane, we said that we were going to do the research and find out where in the United States they ended this. And we did. We found out that Colorado, New Mexico ended it, that New York State has a piece of legislation, and Katerina will be speaking about that, and Connecticut as well. And so Lane has arranged for, tell us about race talk and what we're going to do in the 22nd.
Yeah, we have a racial justice platform, a weekly virtual speakers forum. We bring speakers and host panel discussions to talk about race-related issues. And our first panel discussion about ending qualified immunity is going to be a special episode of Race Talk Revolution. That is the name of the platform. I'm going to share my screen just so that you guys can take note of the date and the time and the link. And if you can see that, those are going to be our guests. Representative Leslie Herod of Colorado is the person that wrote and also pushed through that piece of legislation in Colorado, SB 2217, to end qualified immunity in that state. We will also be speaking with Ms. Lauren Bonds, who is the legal advisor for National Police Accountability Project. That is a lobbying group that works towards ending qualified immunity. And then Captain Lawrence Hunter, retired from the Connecticut, and I think it's Hartford, Connecticut Police Department, who runs a consulting services now for police officers for training and passing the exam. And he will be speaking with us because he says, yes, I am in favor of ending qualified immunity in some cases. So this is going to be an interesting discussion. We're going to hear different sides of the discussion, and this is going to be the first opportunity for us to have this discussion. We're for talking about ending qualified immunity, but also strategizing about how to get that done.
Mhm.
All right. So Wednesday, December 22nd at noon
Right.
Eastern. And you see the registration link right there, tinyurl.com at Talk Race Now.
Now, the important thing is that we want to support the Westchester Coalition for Police Reform and Kenneth Chamberlain by putting monthly forums together, asking people to watch the film, then participate in a 1-hour Zoom discussion where we will be discussing qualified immunity and having speakers, because we want to support the passing of this piece of legislation in New York State. And Katerina, will you tell us about that?
Excuse me, I just want to insert that sometimes I can't do that time of day, Lane, the Race Talk Revolution. And so I register and then I get the link from you.
You get the link, absolutely. And all the recordings are on YouTube. So if you go to YouTube under Race Talk Revolution, you can see all of the recordings, and this one will be there as well. And usually I get it up within 2 days.
Thank you very much, Sandy and Lane. That really was very helpful. And as we segue now to Katerina, who's with a statewide coalition that's working really hard to end qualified immunity in the state of New York. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for having me. I will definitely encourage everyone to attend that talk on the 22nd. I work closely with Lauren Bond from the National Police Accountability Project. She's part of our state coalition, and just had a briefing with Leslie Herod for assembly members last week, and with Assembly Member Pam Hunter, and she is amazing. So I know that talk will be really, really amazing. I'm also glad that the commissioner's staying on, because a huge part of what we're trying to do is really to build with law enforcement. And you'll see that, there are law enforcement members who very much think that this is going to be good for policing. So look forward to being able to continue that conversation with you either on or offline. I'm just going to share my screen really quickly. I'm not able to, but so just to, I wanted to talk about qualified immunity. Sandy, you gave a really good explanation. I'll try not to be too redundant. It's complicated, but it's also super simple.
I've made you co-host if you want to share your screen now.
Great. All right, while I multitask. So, all right, can everyone see that now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so we're a coalition. We're kind of arose out of the protests in 2020, a group of people who came together because they wanted to take concrete action that was really looking at some of the root causes of the violence that we were seeing in New York and in other parts of the country. the coalition has now, rallied around one bill, which I'll tell you about, which we now call the Bill to End Qualified Immunity. And it is, it consists of national groups like the National Police Accountability Project, or the Campaign to End Qualified Immunity, which is chaired by Ben and Jerry of ice cream fame, Every Town for Gun Safety, and then a lot of state organizations like Vocal New York and CCA and Legal Aid Society, and many others. But just to say that we have a very broad spectrum of support, including partnership with the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, LEAP, which is also in favor of ending qualified immunity. We do 1,000 different things. I won't go too much into that, but really, welcome everyone to join in this coalition, whether, it's as the Westchester Coalition or other organizations and groups, that you're a part of, because we see this as a fundamental issue about making sure that victims and survivors of brutality have access to justice, and because we want to make New York safer for everyone. So really briefly, what is qualified immunity? As Sandy said, it is a defense in civil cases. It was invented by the Supreme Court, so it's not an actual law. It's just something that the Supreme Court made during the civil rights movement. We're now marking 50 years of qualified immunity. It was very much a backlash to the civil rights movement. It is primarily used by police and correctional officers in New York State, but it is afforded to all public officials, all state employees. What it does is, let's say I bring a lawsuit against a public official for violating my rights, and that official invokes the defense of qualified immunity, which they almost always do. It's now on me to find a case that is exactly the same, that has the exact same set of circumstances, where an officer has been found guilty of the same thing before. And what that really does is it creates an unjust burden on victims. So we're not asking, did they do something wrong? We're asking just this one technical question, right? Like, is there a case that's exactly the same? And that gets applied and interpreted in really different ways. So sometimes it's as simple as, and I don't mean to be, like glib about this, but like, it's as simple as someone was shot while running away with their arms up and fell into a ditch versus fell into a river. And those are not the same enough for then that officer to now be found guilty. So it creates this unjust burden on victims. It delays cases for years, as you all very well know, given your work and your support of the Chamberlain family. And ultimately, what it ends up being is that it's a pass to violate our rights. So we want to seek, justice for violations of our rights. Murder is the most extreme case, but there's all kinds of violations of our rights. And the courts will say, we're not even going to ask, did they violate your constitutional rights or did they not? What we're only going to ask, has there been another case? So in some instances, we would literally have the courts or the state agencies, Office of Special Investigation or the Department of Corrections, that will say, yes, we know that officers assaulted such and such person, but because there's no other same case, this person is going to be let off. That to me is disturbing. I think a really good example that's really clear, that takes out some of this heat of the, acting in the moment, and and I understand that people who are put into difficult and violent situations, I understand that law enforcement are humans too. But I think this example I'm about to share shows you really the absurdity of qualified immunity. There was a case in which, while executing a search warrant, officers stole $225,000 of cash and coins and other, rare goods from someone's home. The person, not surprisingly, sued the officers not only for justice, but to get compensated for that. And the court said, because there is no other case where a police officer, while executing a search warrant, has stolen $225,000, they are going to be let off. You will not get any justice. You will not get any compensation for what was stolen from you. I think that just really shows, how crazy it is. So why do we need to end it? I think the people of Westchester know really, really intimately and acutely well why you need to end it. And I'm always in awe of the people that we work with. I should mention that I co-lead this campaign with Darlene McDay, who is also battling up against qualified immunity as she's seeking justice for her son, Dante, who was brutally beaten by corrections officers and died. And so, I'm struck by the strength and the power and the clarity on which Kenneth is able to speak on qualified immunity. But, I wanted to highlight something he said at the memorial a few weeks ago. But the government, its agents and officials ought to be held to the same set of rules that enable a fair and functioning society. And that's what we're asking for. We're saying we don't want there to be two systems of justice. We should not have one system of law for us and one for public officials, right? There are other protections, and we can get into, I don't want to get into the weeds, but there are other protections that officers will have within the legal system against frivolous lawsuits and things like that. They don't need to have an entirely, different system. So just to add on to that, why do we think it's so important to end qualified immunity? First and foremost, because we want to make sure that people whose rights are violated have access to justice. What we know, and we hear over and over again, so rarely are officers, law enforcement officers, facing any criminal charges, even in the most egregious cases of murder. So often we hear they don't face any administrative repercussions. And in the case of Darlene's case, right? Every single officer who was found to have beaten her son by the state, by New York State, has not missed one day of work. They still continue to work in the prison today. This creates such an emotional toll on families. And I think you know that well, right? We've heard Kenneth talk about it. Families don't even have the chance to start to mourn the loss of their loved ones because these cases are dragged on for 10 years, or 4 years in the case of Darlene, because of this technicality, which gets used and used and used. And then, as Kenneth says, justice delayed is justice denied. He's not even seeking justice anymore. Darlene doesn't claim to be seeking justice anymore. They want accountability. They want some closure. And in other cases, qualified immunity means that justice is completely denied and there is no, recourse for the actions of those who have violated our rights. I know that, organizations such as this one are working really, really hard on creating the reforms, and police departments are also working really hard on creating extremely important reforms. But I do want to say, and this is something that I think is very important and central to our campaign, is that without these additional accountability mechanisms, if we don't have a way to hold people accountable if and when they break these new rules and laws that we pass, then what are we doing, right? And so the example I like to give is that chokeholds were banned in New York City before Eric Gardner was murdered in a chokehold. But because we have this culture of impunity that continues to persist, we've told law enforcement that they are likely to not face any consequences if they do break these laws. Why would any behavior change, right? And so what we're really looking for is this is not about punishing individual officers. This is about creating systemic change. This is about addressing the root causes and really kind of changing this culture of impunity that we have to one of accountability. We want to prevent the violence from happening in the first place. And we know that that violence is primarily targeted towards Black and Brown New Yorkers. And I think another really good example of how this is really about prevention and of violence prevention is that shortly after the New York City limited qualified immunity for NYPD, the law firm representing the PBA and the SBA sent out a letter to all of its members saying that do not engage in any interactions with the public, do not engage in any in any stop and frisk unless you are, quote, unequivocally sure your actions are above the law. And that's the kind of systemic change that we want qualified immunity to bring about. I saw Kenneth just came on. I'm sorry, Kenneth, you missed my shout out and your quote, but I'm happy to be here with you all.
If you want to show him the previous slide with his photo at the vigil, I'm sure.
Oh, okay. There you are, Kenneth. And so again, this law specifically is in New York State is not about punishing law enforcement. And law enforcement also agrees that this is necessary for systemic change. So here in this photo is the former police chief of Albany, Brendan Cox, Chief Cox, who is very much a supporter of ending qualified immunity. This is him at a rally with us in Albany last May. And he was also on this briefing with Leslie Herod and others that I just mentioned. And he very much sees this as a key and fundamental part of creating better policing, which is ultimately better for all New Yorkers. It is safer for law enforcement and it's safer for us if we have trust between communities and their police officers, but qualified immunity and the idea that law enforcement is, part of a different system of law completely erodes trust. So the bill specifically that we're working on, the bill to end qualified immunity, is the best bill to end qualified immunity as in the entire country. So Sandy mentioned other states and cities where there have been ends and limits to qualified immunity, but this bill is really the best bill that has ever been drafted. And I say that, based on information of like legal scholars who study this. The bill would basically create a workaround. So right now, for example, when Darlene or Kenneth wanted to sue law enforcement, they have to do that in federal court. But now this bill, if this bill were passed, we would be able to bring those lawsuits against public officials in New York State court. And in New York State court, the use of qualified immunity would be completely prohibited. There would be no circumstance in which someone could say, no, go ahead and try to find a case exactly like this one if you want to get past the hurdle of qualified immunity, right? This would mean that cases are going to be heard on their merits. Were someone's rights violated or not? And that's what's going to be at stake, not this technicality. And then this other really important piece of this law that I want to mention is that it includes financial incentives for civil rights attorneys to take these cases on. I know we have Mayo Bartlett on the call as well, and there are so many amazing civil rights attorneys. But Darlene was denied by 20 law firms before she got someone to take her case. And that was only because she came with enough information from FOIL requests. So attorneys know that the hurdle of qualified immunity, the difficulty of trying to find a same exact case in these opaque systems, and the fact that these cases get dragged on for years and years really disincentivizes attorneys to take these cases on. And we want to flip that on its head. So this bill has gotten a lot of traction. We're really excited about the next legislative session. And the last thing that I want to say is I cannot stress how important the role of Westchester is in this fight. And why do I say that? Because given the political dynamics, the biggest roadblock that we currently face in getting this common sense legislation passed is your state senator. And I want to encourage you all, and I know you do, this is an extremely politically active group, right? But our state senators work for us. They represent us and they work for us. But I just want to stress that to say, Westchester will really play an outsized role in this fight in the upcoming legislative session. And so with that, I invite all of you to please join this fight with us. I will send out, however you correspond in the follow-up, Nada, please, I would love to send out either a one-pager or our website. We have really easy ways to take action, to at least write to your state legislators, your assembly and Senate members.
This is really helpful, Katerina, and I think for Westchester, do you know, have you approached Senator Shelley Mayer besides Senator Andrea Stewart-Cousins?
Yes, so we've had conversations with both of them, and in my last conversation with Senator Mayer's team, she, her team, not her team, you know, they spoke to the difficulties of the district, right? We know that in that district, there are a lot of law enforcement, a lot of NYPD officers live in that district even. And so because there has been fallout following the repeal of 50A, but again, like the commissioner said, everybody benefits from transparency. There is hesitancy to really take these issues on.
Do you feel like you have the support in the New York Assembly for it to pass, and that's why you're focusing on the Senate?
So we're focusing on both. We feel very, very strongly about the Assembly, and our our focus is it's a multi-prong effort. So I would actually, so we're absolutely focusing on both.
You know what I'll suggest, because we're out of time, is that we will definitely continue this conversation, and if there are members of WCPR who are willing to actually schedule meetings with the elected officials, with the assembly members, with the senators who are their representatives, and perhaps to invite you or another member of the statewide coalition to attend the meetings, I think that might have more sway. So we'll definitely continue the conversation. And if you could put your contact info in the chat, Katerina, and answer Jeff's question also. If other questions too that come in the chat, Katerina will be happy to answer them, and we will definitely be working together more. So I really thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And the last thing I'll say is in Albany, we'll be having a lobby day and rally. And I know, we were already talking to Kenneth about that, but just putting that on the agenda for you all to think about in the upcoming month.
Excellent. Well, that was fabulous. And I appreciate the few number of slides. That was really helpful that you didn't overwhelm us with lots of slides.